Okay, we ready to go?
1 second. It's going live now.
I think we'll have a quorum now, and at the very least for this, we ought to preface this meeting with the fact that it's not a
All right, and you guys are live.
It's not an official commission meeting.
All right.
What it is,
Okay.
actually.
Good
So, Sal,
evening, everyone. Welcome to a event hosted by the Planning Commission and the Nitty Gritty Committee. We're honored to welcome Shelley Rowe tonight, who is a nationally known speaker on transportation and is also very familiar to the Eastport denizens of Annapolis. She's going to talk tonight about the future of transportation. And we're just so glad you could come and spend some time with us. We would like everyone to please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. So if you could keep yourself on mute to keep down the background noise, that would be very helpful for Shelley. And if you type a question into chat, she will try to check it and keep up with it. But if not, we will get to it. We can circle back to it at the end of the presentation. So we're so happy to welcome Shelley. Thanks so much for coming.
You're
And
very
before
welcome,
Shelley starts
Shelley.
talking, Shelley, I
Oh,
need to add
sorry,
in one
Ben,
more
you
item.
say a word?
This is Ben Sell from the Planning Commission, the chairman. I'd like to also note that since this is not an official public hearing for the Planning Commission, we're just attending this as an informational session. However, we cannot be bringing up projects that are under review by the Planning Commission right now in regards to this conversation. So if that does happen, we'll try to go in and stop the conversation, but because we don't have a quorum and all of those kind of things in a public meeting. So just want to make that known. So if there's an application under review by the Planning Commission and Planning and Zoning, we cannot bring that up into our conversations. Thank you. Anything wrong with that, Sally? Do you disagree? Okay, I'm done. Thank you, Shelley.
I'm sure. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for the opportunity to be with you all today. It is a privilege to be here and to just share some information. I thought it actually might be useful to give you a little background about why I am here. It's Bob Waldman's fault. It's just that simple. I've known Bob for a long time, and I bumped into him at a social event in December, and we got to chatting, of course, about what's going on in the city and all of that. And I told him about this program that I do. I've done it quite often for state departments of transportation organizations. And he asked if I'd be willing to share it with you all. And I said, of course I would. You know, this is my home. I love Annapolis. I love Eastport, even though I'm not living there. I still consider myself from Eastport. And so I offer this program to you today in the context of the comprehensive plan. So where my head is thinking about a 10 to 20 year horizon for comprehensive planning. And you should know, and what I will reiterate is that this is a particularly difficult time in the history of transportation for planning. The goal of the program today is just to give you some information about trends. Some are transportation trends and some are not transportation trends, but the power comes when they converge. So I talk about connecting the dots, and the convergence of these trends is what is creating a transformative moment in transportation unlike any that we have seen before. So my suggestion to you is just kind of listen to the trends and then think about how they connect, because that is where the power lies. Where do they connect, and what does it mean in the Annapolis area, and how can we take these trends into account as we think about a 10 to 20 year time horizon for transportation in Annapolis. I won't get super specific. As Sally said, I welcome you to type things into the chat area. I will try to follow those, but there's just quite a number of us. So as I see things pop up, I will try to read those. And if it's something that we want to talk about right then, I will. Otherwise, we can talk about it a little bit later. And I'm happy to answer any questions that I can about transportation and how it looks in the future. So again, what I like to do is to look at all these trends that are converging, because it is an unusual moment in history for transportation. It is transforming so quickly and so dramatically. So let's just walk through some of these dots that are connecting in transportation. One of the ones that I like to start with is about the customer. And I think it's instructive to think about who is the customer that you're planning for, that we are planning for. And there are two demographics that are really at play right now. This is one of them. And that statistic on the screen, I think, is particularly interesting. More than half of all people who have ever turned 80 are still alive today. That says a lot about the aging population. And we see that there's a growth in the aging population in the workforce as well. And that might be exacerbated by some of the coronavirus situation as well. Now, at the same time, while we have this demographic, and I have to say, selfishly, in your 20-year time horizon, I'm going to be in this demographic. I would love to think that you're planning for me, but honestly, from a transportation professional's perspective, I hope you're planning for this demographic. And these are the digital natives. These are the ones who are really going to be in the key part of the workforce in a 20-year time horizon. They have a very different way of seeing the world. They have different ways of traveling. They have a different way of communicating and engaging with information. So it's instructive for us to think about how this client, this customer, is going to use transportation and how it's going to use information. So we have 2.7 billion smartphone users worldwide. They're getting 60 to 80 notifications a day. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds low. I swear I get more than that every single day. This sounds about right. Lots of phone time. 82% of teenagers use a smartphone these days. I think that's
Sally,
actually...
I hate to interrupt you, but we don't see your presentation.
Okay. Okay, we had it shared before. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes, now I see it.
Okay, all right. Something must have happened when we reconnected because it was on before. But all right, so this is the image from before. So that's the quote that I was mentioning. 50% of all people who've ever turned 80 are still alive today. So that's a crazy high number. The digital natives, here are some of the data statistics we were just talking about, and the gig economy. And so we're hearing a lot about that right now. 70% of the world's workforce would be on demand by 2025. So that's right around the corner, particularly when we talk about comprehensive planning kind of timeframes. What does that mean for transportation? Because that's a really big number. And we're seeing how COVID has impacted transportation right now. And it's unlikely to go back to the way it was before. We just don't know what it will be like going forward. But that on-demand workforce is changing the nature of transportation as well. So these are some of the numbers that we see for engagement on social media, 10.5 hours a day when you combine all kinds of applications. So this demographic is highly, highly connected. This is the way they're consuming information. This is where they're getting their information. This is where they're engaging not only with each other and their friends, they're engaging with transportation and services through apps and their phone. This is another characteristic of this demographic. Look at this, 40% of 17-year-olds have a driver's license. Now, as Frida was saying before, as Frida and Sally and I are from Texas, I can tell you that the day I turned 16 and one day, I had a driver's license. 100% of us did. But now for this demographic, it's just not as important. When I lived in Eastport, my neighbor across the street had 3 boys. And when his oldest son was old enough to start taking driver's lessons and do his practice driving, his dad would stand out in the middle of the street and complain to us. He said, I can't get him to drive. I've had to threaten to take the computer away from him to get him to do the driving he needs to take his driving test. He's just not interested in driving. And we see that more pervasively with that younger generation that I would suggest is part of who you're planning for in that comprehensive plan timeframe. That's one of the reasons, not the entire reason, but it is one of the contributing factors as to why the vehicles mile traveled today are at a 2002 level. So they were growing. We've had a dip and now it's beginning to come back up, but it's still historically low compared to what it has been. So that demographic has a different relationship with transportation right from the get-go. So that's one dot, one factor to consider. If we look at a different dot, interaction, it's no news that we're all connected. You probably have more than one piece of equipment right available to you right now that has connectivity. There's no news there. The news is about the level of interaction and the speed of the technology that we're seeing right now. So some of you might recognize this as Mr. Moore from Moore's Law. You see Moore's Law stated there on the screen. And it's about the growth, the geometric exponential growth factor in technology and the robustness of technology. So in fact, the Intel engineers, because he worked for Intel at the time, the Intel engineers applied Moore's Law to a 1971 Volkswagen Beetle. So if you applied Moore's Law to that vehicle, today you'd have a car that could go 300,000 miles per hour. You would get 2 million miles per gallon of gas, and it would cost you 4 cents. So it speaks to the range and the scale of disruption of the technology and what it implies about our interaction. So again, if you look at some of these numbers, 2018 was a big year. 2018 was the first year that mobile internet traffic exceeded 50% of all internet traffic. And we're just seeing that trend grow and grow. This is one of the dots that we need to be aware of. It's mobile communication, particularly that other demographic is looking at. Look at some of these numbers, just to give you a sense of scale of the level of interaction that we're seeing. 95 million photos and videos shared on Instagram daily. 80% of people are more likely to read colored visuals. So that's why you see the rise of YouTube. That's a very important trend as well for us to pay attention to, because this is the way people want to consume information and what's going to be impactful for them. They prefer video platforms rather than TV. Look at this one. Every minute, 350,000 updates are sent to Twitter. Now, what I typically say at this point is that number is a little inflated because we think about a third of those are from the president, but I won't say that to you all today. If you look at Facebook alone, 2.23 billion monthly active users. That's a third of the world population. 88% of those are mobile users. It is all about mobile visual traffic. 500,000 comments posted every minute, 5 new profiles created every second, 300 million photos uploaded to Facebook every day. Mobile visual. That's the way communication is going to be in the time frame that you're looking at for your comprehensive plan, for our comprehensive plan. The other trend that we're seeing is mobile e-commerce. 45% of all e-commerce is on a mobile platform. So what does that imply about how you're going to consume city services? What does it imply about how you're going to consume transportation services and pay for them? Mobile visual e-commerce is the way that the demographic is going, and they're going to want and expect to communicate and exchange information that way. Airbnb is a really interesting model that gives us a sense of speed, Airbnb was established in 2008, 12 years ago. You're looking at a comprehensive plan that's in the 10 to 20 year time frame. So Airbnb started 12 years ago. This is the size of Airbnb today. 1 million listings, 34,000 cities in over 190 countries. Now, to give you a sense of scale, let's compare that to Hilton. Brick and mortar company. Hilton was started in 1919. It is a 100-year-old company. Airbnb surpassed the number of rooms of Hilton in 12 years. And you all know not only has it surpassed the number of rooms, but it's created a disruption in communities and how we use our communities. It's been a disruptive force, whether for good or bad, doesn't matter, but it has changed the way that that we live and work in our communities in a period of 12 years. It's been so fast. Look at this image. I love this. This is not original. I saw this done and I went and found the images, so I can't take credit for it. This was taken at the Vatican, obviously in 2005. I'm going to show you a similar shot taken in 2013, 8 years later. That's the impact of technology. And once again, mobile visual. One of the things that this implies is that we have to internalize that we live in a time when anyone can comment on and photograph everything that we do. This has huge implications for maintenance crews, for responsiveness. A couple of years ago, I was reading an article in the Washington Post. And the article was about a gentleman who was traveling in our region in the DC area, and he was on the Red Line on Metro, and then he was on Amtrak. And in both cases, he experienced a service disruption. When he was on the Red Line at Metro, he tweeted to Metro about the service disruption, and he got no response. He was later on Amtrak. There was a service disruption. He tweeted it to Amtrak. Amtrak tweeted back and said, "Thank you for the information. We have forwarded this to our service department and they're going to look into it. Thank you so much for letting us know." The article in the Washington Post was not about the service disruption. It was about the lack of responsiveness to a tweet by Metro. The expectation is that there are digital dialogues and they're happening on a mobile device and they're happening quickly. 60% expect use social media to report a service issue. 30% of them expect a response in an hour on their platform. What does that imply about the kind of information we're going to put out to people, to our citizens, travelers, visitors in Annapolis? What does it imply about the capability of either the city or the service providers that we have providing service around transportation? This is the expectation today. Fast forward that when it's even more mobile, more visual into the future. So let's look at another dot. Data. It's not about the data, it's about the information that we can create out of the data. Check out this statistic. Today, 20 households create more internet traffic than the entire internet in 2008. Again, a 12-year span. Huge, huge growth of data on the internet. It has been said, Frida, this one's for you. It has been said that data is the new oil. Data is the new oil. Here's why. It's anticipated that the data analytics market is expected to be $275 billion in just a few years. Now, my field, when I worked at the U.S. Department of Transportation, was in the area of connected vehicles. If you could monetize and capture all the data on a vehicle, it would be a $33 billion opportunity. This is why we're seeing the rush and the push for automated vehicles. It's not because it's cool and fun, and I do think it's cool and fun. It is because there is a lot of money to be made here if we can monetize this kind of data that lives on a car. It's astonishing the amount of data on a car. And that's why you see this level of investment by automotive companies and technology companies. Google spending $60 million, and that number's gone up since then. Ford, GM, Toyota, $1 billion. $60 billion spent in the last 3 years, and that was in 2018, and it has continued to grow. The other thing that's important about this is that this is what's driving transportation these days. When I grew up as a transportation engineer working for USDOT, The funding and the projects that we did through federal transportation and state transportation and local transportation dollars drove the transportation environment. It drove the policy. No more. This is the driver. Now, what we experience at the federal, state, local level is trying to react to what is happening to us from this technology revolution because it's going so quickly. This is what's driving and pushing transportation investment and policy. The other thing about information is you have a number of companies out there that provide transportation information. Waze, I suspect you're all familiar with Waze. Again, it's a great example. It's mobile-based and it's very highly visible. It's a great example of some of those trends converging. Waze has a part of their organization that is designed to work with public entities, where they will do a data sharing situation so that public agencies can get and use the data that Waze is receiving, and they can use the data that you have because they don't have everything. INRIX here are both other transportation companies that have transportation data, a lot of it cell phone based, that they can provide to agencies that provide the data to give you a better picture of what's going on operationally in the transportation arena for the city. The other trend that we see with data, you already know this, it's personalized data, right? Amazon says, hi, Shelly, your package is going to arrive tomorrow. Amazon also says, this happened to me last night. I finished reading a book on Kindle, and the minute I swiped the last page, it popped up and said, Shelly, recommended for you these 5 books. Twitter, you follow somebody on Twitter, and Twitter says, hey, if you want to follow them, here's 5 other people you might want to follow. LinkedIn, I think, is the one that's most interesting. You connect with somebody on LinkedIn, and then LinkedIn pops up all these people's names and says, you might know these people. Invite them to connect with you on LinkedIn. They're not even on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is getting you to do their marketing for them, but it is personalized information. If that's what we're experiencing in these parts of our lives, that's what the younger generation, those for whom we're planning, that's what they expect for transportation. How are they getting personalized transportation information? Why is their car not giving them personalized information? And to be sure, the automotive industry is watching these dots connect, and they're looking to provide that level of personalized data in the driving and the automotive experience, not necessarily driving. So if we look at connecting some of the dots, the question becomes, how are we going to engage in digital dialogues? How can we provide information that is both mobile friendly and highly visual? How can we support e-commerce online in a mobile application? And I do know, because we were talking with Ben beforehand, this city has an app or has a website that shows the circulator. So I've been on it. I didn't put the image here on the screen. It's kind of kludgy. That's just not going to work going forward. And what we see with a lot of transportation agencies, public agencies, is that they partner with the firm who's there's expertise. You know, there's commercial software, there's commercial apps that are available that provide that in a very seamless, highly designed, highly visible way, because that's what's expected. Leveraging and sharing data, data is the new oil. How can we take that data and begin to learn how to use it? So let's look at another dot. Let's look at vehicles. It's no longer about horsepower, it's about processing power. And perhaps you've seen this statistic. The first space shuttle had 500,000 lines of code. Ford estimates that a current vehicle, 2020, has 100 billion lines of code. It's a very sophisticated rolling computer. Horsepower is a footnote in what a vehicle is today. It's about computing power. So this is connected vehicles. I mentioned this before. This is the research program that I ran for USDOT on connected vehicles. I'm happy to talk more about this, but just to give you just a little bit of a feel for it, if you're not familiar, this is technology that has the vehicle has a specific piece of equipment on board the vehicle, and it takes some of the data off the vehicle and it pumps it out 10 times a second, 360 degrees around the vehicle. A similarly equipped vehicle captures that data internally processes it and is able to give the driver real-time, in the moment crash warning information. It's still being researched, and so when we talk about it in the industry, we talk about vehicle-to-vehicle communication. There's a lot going on in that world. So no one is, so I see the question, the DOT is not running that program. The vehicles communicate to each other. There's a very sophisticated security system that has to be set up to make that happen. The vehicles are communicating with each other. There's nobody, up here doing like puppeteer running the show. It's just vehicle-to-vehicle communication. There is also the capacity to do vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. The example there is traffic signals. So the traffic signal, just like the vehicle, takes data off the traffic signal, pumps it out into the air. The vehicle is able to capture that data, use it internally to the vehicle, and it gives it a real-time safety or operational information. Now, this could be relevant to you, particularly in that 10 to 20 year time horizon, because as you look at traffic signal systems, you want to be equipped for this technology. You don't want to put something in right now that you can't accommodate this technology in the future. My main message to you today is going to be about flexibility. This is one way to be flexible. So let's look more at automated vehicles. This is what the Google car sees. So as you just look at this tiny little clip, you'll see that it's processing another vehicle, it's processing a bicycle, it's navigating the roadway. There's a curb in the middle of the roadway, there's intersections. But just imagine the amount of data that it's sucking in and processing to manage its movement along that roadway and how it's connecting and interacting with those vehicles. It's a ton of data that's being processed, and data is the new oil. Now, you may be aware of this. I don't know, but I'm assuming that you're aware that automated vehicles, we talk about it in terms of levels. This is SAE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, and US DOT adopted their construct. Levels 0 to 5. 5 being a 100% fully automated vehicle. The driver does nothing in the vehicle. That will take quite some time to get there. It's an extremely complicated problem. What you see the automotive industry working on today are level 3 and 4 automation. That's where we're seeing a lot of the work. It's more attainable, more near term than a level 5. Level 2 is on the market. A level 3, you could argue, is some of that is on the market, but this is where the investment is being made in these different levels of automation. Some of these projections, I think this is, I wouldn't personally agree with this one, but it speaks to what is believed to be the fast pace of automated vehicle deployment. So this was from 2017 from Fortune magazine. They projected that by 2040, right? So still within that planning horizon for a comprehensive plan, 95% of all new vehicles sold would be automated vehicles. IBM, also in this market space, predicts that 15% of new cars sold by 2030 will be automated vehicles. We do not expect it to be a linear growth. We expect it to be geometric. That's why we see today 57 companies are authorized to test AVs in California, and that's growing. The reason it's specific to California is they're the only state that requires registration for testing, and that's why we know how many companies are testing. In 2018, 30 states were looking at proposals to regulate or allow automated vehicles. The push is to allow a lot of this testing because it's seen as an economic development opportunity, and indeed, it can work. I do a lot of work with the Texas DOT, Frida and Sally, so our Texas connections, and their legislature created some enabling legislation for automated vehicles, and consequently, they've seen some industry move into the state to support this level of testing and development. A lot of money at stake here. Now, unfortunately, as I'm sure you know, there have been some very high profile and very unfortunate crashes. And those have created a problem, not only because they were very unfortunate in the situations that were involved, but it shook the foundation of public confidence. A research study that was done shortly after some of those crashes showed this. 61% of Americans are not inclined to ride in a self-driving car. Now, that was done shortly after some of those crashes. If you connect the dots and you look at the generation who's more likely to be using these vehicles, I actually think that's going to change. I don't think we're going to see quite this level of concern. This is what you saw at the time. 69% are concerned about sharing the road with AVs. This is an interesting point. During the time frame where we're talking about a comprehensive plan, that is the time frame where there will be both regular dumb vehicles and automated vehicles. They will be coexisting on the same piece of infrastructure. That is the biggest problem we have. How to create that coexistence as the fleet begins to turn over into more of an automated vehicle approach. If everything could go poof and suddenly be automated, it would be a whole lot simpler, but we don't have that luxury, and it's going to be a gradual turnover in the fleet. The other thing, and we'll get to in just a moment, we don't expect automated vehicles to be primarily single owner. We don't expect that to be the model for transportation in the future. Because of some of the concerns we've seen, we're seeing some of these slower shuttles. This is an automated shuttle by Drive AI. This particular test, I believe, is being done in Frisco, Texas. And what you see here, this is being done in a closed environment at low speed. A number of those going on around the country. What I think is interesting about this one is that they're taking into account that a pedestrian doesn't know what the car is thinking. And so they created ways for the car to communicate to the pedestrian so they know what's happening. So these are kinds of things that you're seeing being tested a lot of different places. This is kind of the current state of being. This is actually a quote that's a couple of years old. If you're not aware, Waymo is Google's arm for self-driving vehicles. So this is their branch of Google that's doing all the testing and the research for automated vehicles. We had for quite some time, we had a lot of people talking about how quickly automated vehicles were going to come into being. Elon Musk was very forward-leaning in his dates in all of what he was saying, and a lot of companies were too. Then we had some of those crashes. The researchers began to understand how super complex level 5 automated vehicles are. And so what you saw is quotes like this, that widely available self-driving cars will take longer than you think. The rest of this article said it's time for AV companies to slow down and shut up. And that's exactly what we've seen. We don't see nearly as much in the media with these very, very aggressive timeframes, but make no mistake, they are doing the research because there's just too much money at stake, and it's a whole shift in the ecosystem around transportation. Electric vehicles, and so the question about would city county regulate the self-driving vehicles? You know, I don't know what the legalities are around that. The problem is that it does not work to have small jurisdictions, even at a state level, separately regulating self-driving vehicles. That's why there's so much hubbub about federal regulation around this. But the federal Congress has been unable to create any self-driving vehicle legislation, which is a problem. Because it doesn't work, obviously, if you're General Motors to create a self-driving vehicle that works in California, but is different for Annapolis. So as this evolves, you're going to see a huge push. The automotive industry would much prefer that it be at a federal level. That's what we're going to have to get to in order to be able to have it be robust and workable. Electric vehicles, another big trend that we're seeing. Volvo very heavily into electric vehicles. By 2040, again, within this time window we're looking at, the majority of new car sales outside of the US will be electric. These are some of the projections we're seeing for the increase in EV charging stations. And this is right around the corner. So this is growing right now, and again, growing geometrically. This is something, again, to be thoughtful about what does this mean around comprehensive planning, about transportation usage in Annapolis over that kind of time horizon. In the industry where I live, we talk about ACES vehicles, automated, connected, electric, and shared. Shared. That takes us to the next dot, which is extremely powerful. This is the shift from driving as in a car to driving as a service. So no longer do we see that it's going to be about what kind of car do I own that's parked in my garage right here, but it's how do I access transportation as a service? And by the way, it's on a phone, it's mobile, and it's visual. And we're seeing it being tested today. Uber is an early entrant, is an enabler. Now, Uber is also interesting. It started in 2009. Uber is 11 years old, and it has already been a significant disruptor in transportation in 11 years. In the space of your comprehensive plan, you can have another Uber that zooms in here and completely changes the nature of transportation. Google, they're not stupid. They're connecting the dots. They're looking at the same trends that we're talking about here, and they're saying the trend is shared use automated vehicles. Shared use automated. Yeah, but they will be. This is the kind of, because they're seeing the long game about where you're getting data is the new oil. It's not about the transportation service. This is some of the trends that we're seeing that's contributing to that belief that we've got a whole new model here that's happening. So you're seeing the rise of these app-based services like Uber, Lyft, Maven is General Motors' entrance into this. And again, connect the dots. 39% of young people say they can get around just fine without driving. And you think about my old neighbor in Eastport, he really didn't want to drive. If he can get around on Uber, if a Zip car was another one for a longer distance travel. And my friends today, if they're going to go downtown Annapolis to go to the restaurant, and let's look forward to the day we can do that again, they would much rather get an Uber than have to worry about parking, worry about drinking. And they're using Uber as a way to get around locally because it's more convenient. This is Maven. Again, you're seeing General Motors. They want to be in the act. The big automotive industries, they don't see themselves as car companies anymore. They see them as transportation service companies. And they're fundamentally shifting their business model to be able to be the service provider for automated transportation services. And you won't necessarily buy your car from General Motors, but you might get your transportation service from General Motors. Now, we don't know, so TNCs are transportation network companies, if you're not familiar with that acronym. This is a study that was done in New York City relatively recently. I think it's maybe about a year old, because we're still learning what some of the impacts of these kinds of companies are to our network. And in New York, it's not been great. It's not what we would have hoped. And what you're seeing is that they're pirating ridership from transit, walkers, and bikers. Now, they're aware, these companies are aware of this, and I would say many of them that I get to hear in panel sessions and that sort of thing, they're trying to be a better company about this area, to be more of a last mile solution, because it is not possible, for example, in New York City, to take all the people off of transit and put them in a car. It's untenable, it is unworkable in a city setting. So we need transit. We need alternative modes, and these services need to be complementary to that. We don't know yet how to help that, encourage it, and make it so, because this is problematic, and it becomes some policy issues. So here's why there's such a rush. So this is what the CEO of Lyft put out several years ago. Now, obviously, it didn't go as fast, but these are the kinds of things that they're thinking about. They don't think about themselves as someone giving us a ride that I can call to take me to the airport. They're thinking of themselves as an enabler of a much, much bigger transportation picture. And they're looking at a fully autonomous system that will use their transportation, their shared use vehicles. Part of the driver here, look at the numbers of hours that we spend in a vehicle. That time can be monetized. Imagine the inside of the vehicle being advertisement. I don't have to drive the car, but on the inside of the window, on the inside of the vehicle, I'm seeing advertisements, I'm seeing movie trailers. That time can be monetized. That's another place where we're seeing this big push to get this technology because there's so much money at stake. So again, if we do some connecting of the dots, what we believe is that most self-driving cars will be used in a mobility as a service model. So let me put just a little finer point on that. This is what's being tested right now. Rather than have my car in the garage, I have an app on my phone that I have prepaid. I call up the transportation service that I need. The automated vehicle that's shared use comes and picks me up and it takes me to Giant. It drops me off, but by this time it's gotten a call from Frida. So it goes to Eastport, it picks up Frida and it takes her over to EYC. But now it's gotten a call now from Ben and it goes to pick up Ben and takes him over to CBS. So the same number of trips are happening, but with fewer vehicles because they don't ever stop. They're just constantly in motion until the total demand begins to slow down. That's the mobility as a service model that we're seeing come online. It's beginning now. We're seeing a lot of people testing this, and we see it in Europe for sure. This was a study that was done in New York about the yellow cab system, and they studied what would it be like if you took New York City's yellow cab system and replaced it with shared use automated vehicles. If you could do that, the cost per trip drops from $4 per trip mile to 50 cents per trip mile. When you get on the outer edges of this model, then why would I have a garage over here with this vehicle that I've got to pay gas and maintenance for when I can get where I need to go with my transportation service model? That's why you see CEOs like at Ford Motor Company, they're very forward leaning. They have this quote, and he's talking about the power of artificial intelligence and the rise of autonomous connected vehicles. And it says it's a technology that won't incrementally improve the old system, but can completely disrupt it. It is a total redesign of the surface transportation system. And it's happening within the footprint of your comprehensive plan. It is extremely, extremely difficult to grapple with this level of disruption and disruptive change today. And yet that's the situation we're in, and it doesn't, we have to be thoughtful about how we do it. It's kind of like dog years and people years. Yeah, so technology is like the dog years. It's just going much faster. Those of us who've always been in transportation, we're like people years, and we're just kind of plodding along. We're seeing things like self-driving vehicles, mobility as a service, connected vehicles in these timeframes. At the same time, we're planning, designing, and investing in things that have a 40-year lifespan. For sure, bridges, roadways, heavy rail transit, parking garages are in a 40-year time frame. That's well within the time we're going to see huge levels of disruption. So it begs the question of what do we do with that? There are a lot of implications. Let's just look at some of these numbers. And of course, parking is a big thing in Annapolis. Look at some of the numbers. The average car sits idle for 22 hours a day. I didn't believe that when I first read it until I figured out what I do with my car. And even when I was commuting to US DOT every day, my car was idle 21 hours a day. And that was with me commuting every single day. There are 3 to 8 parking spaces per vehicle in the US. Across the world, there are over 1 billion cars, and yet there are 2 billion parking spaces in the US. We've got so much real estate tied up in parking. When we are approaching an environment where a shared use automated vehicle can make 5 times the number of trips as a single one owner vehicle can today. So again, it doesn't expect to reduce the number of trips, but you service those trips with fewer vehicles that don't stop moving and they don't have to park as much. Obviously, land use implications. These are some of the studies we're seeing in large cities. About a third of commercial central business districts space in most large urban areas is parking. There's bound to be something better to do with that real estate. It's this dynamic that has allowed cities like San Francisco to repurpose a lot of their on-street parking because they're not seeing as much traffic and a different use of the space. And we'll get to that too. Here's the use of the space. Absolutely something that needs to be considered in a comprehensive plan context, and that's curb space. I predict, most of us think, that there's going to be a food fight for curb space because everybody needs access, whether it's for parking, deliveries, vehicle charging, bike sharing, smart meters, mobility as a service models, transportation network companies. So it's some way to manage the pickup and drop off space. What I hear from developers like apartment buildings. In a typical apartment building, you provide X number of parking spaces for the residents, and now they may not have a car, depending on what they need it for, or it doesn't move, but what they do have is a lot of pickup and drop-offs. They want to have access to an Uber or a Lyft. They want to have FedEx or US Postal Service or Amazon dropping things off. And yes, I agree with one of the questions that came in too. My street has been much busier with those vehicles right now. Curb space is going to be a big thing to manage in the future, perhaps even more so than parking. Here's another problem child in today's world, and that's transportation modeling. For most of my career until now, we've collected historic transportation data. We've put it into models that have been validated and tuned based on our historic use of the transportation system. We crunch those numbers and we spit out a projection for what transportation numbers look like 10 to 20 years in the future. There's no chance in the world that those numbers today can be accurate. We don't have the models because we don't know how to tune them. We don't know how people are going to use the system. We don't know what kind of penetration rate we're going to have. It isn't possible today to use the same models we have been using and create anything that remotely resembles reliable transportation predictions. It's a problem in the transportation planning industry. So what we see them talking about and looking at are scenario plans. If we have this scenario for automated vehicles, what does that look like? If we have this scenario for automated vehicles, what does that look like? And you begin to see some boundaries of what the future might look like to give you some guide rails for how to make investments that have flexibility, where you can accommodate. If it's this way, it works. And if it has the room to grow to this, it works as well. Or in some cases, it shrinks the footprint for transportation. Transportation planning in this environment is extremely difficult and very hard to do. And so this is the key point, it's all about flexibility. This is a National League of Cities study. It was done a few years ago, and I trust that it's changed a lot since then. At that time, only 6% of city and regional transportation plans considered self-driving vehicles, and only 3% of transit plans considered services like Uber and Lyft. And we knew we could see these trends coming 4 years ago for sure. It's very heartening to me as an Annapolis resident to see that you all are thinking about these things. It's a very sophisticated citizenship here, and there's a lot of conversation and awareness of these trends already, and it's great to see it being factored into the thinking for a comprehensive plan. Here's another impact, revenue. As you just look at the revenue generation on that screen, you'll notice that all of that is predicated on a single vehicle owner model. And yet you see the quote from Rob Spiller. He's the transportation director for the city of Austin. He said half of the revenue for transportation capacity and operations is based on a parking model that will be obsolete in a dozen years. That's a tough one. And it's not just a parking model, but it's the entire transportation system at a federal level. The way we fund transportation today is not sustainable, and yet we have been unable to grapple with that issue at a federal level. It will hit at the city level as well as you see these trends start to take hold. And it's some of it, and this is where I think it's really fascinating to think about transportation policy. Yeah, so this question, how does COVID impact these projections? We don't know. We don't know how COVID is going to impact it. You know, we can guess that now a lot of us have figured out that we can work from home, and that we'll see, we might not see as much as we see right now, at least I hope not, but we're unlikely to go back to everybody going back to work in an office building. So our guess, but it's a guess, is that it's going to be somewhere in between. And so what does that do to transportation? And again, it's another big unknown that makes it extremely difficult to plan in this environment. And part of the public policy piece, which I think is fascinating, we haven't even begun to grapple with some of these big items because they're not clear enough yet. As a young engineer in transportation, we talked a lot about HOV lanes, high occupancy vehicle lanes, right? So how do we feel about zero occupancy vehicles? Is it okay for Uber Eats, for example, to be an automated vehicle and to not have anybody in it driving the vehicle, and all that's in it is a Big Mac? Is that okay with us? Those are public policy issues we haven't even begun to grapple with. The other thing that I grew up with was transit-oriented development. And we've seen a lot of it in this region. It's been very popular because, again, you see that younger generation, they don't want to drive. They're living next to metro stations. It's extremely attractive real estate for them. Well, that's transit-oriented development. What does automated-oriented development look like? We don't really know. How can we imagine what an automated-oriented transportation network, how is that going to operate? How is that going to behave? It's a very interesting dynamic right now to think about what would that be? And there are a lot of people who are trying to think about those kinds of issues. But this is the state of the world today in transportation. We don't really know. And while I appreciate that didn't give you a lot of information, that is real. In a very brief Google search, when I look at the future of transportation, I found two things. One prediction is we're going to see 80% fewer cars on the road because there's shared use. We don't have to make as many trips. 80% fewer cars on the road. This is the other projection. We're going to see auto-induced exurb sprawl because you can get in your automated vehicle and it'll take you out to the suburbs and you can live and work out there and you don't have to come into the office as much anyway. But the bottom line is it's a big crystal ball. Right now, we don't know adoption rates for automated vehicles. We don't know penetration rates. We don't know rollout scenarios. We don't know the impact on capacity, mode split, transit, safety. We don't know so many things that are still evolving and trying to become clear. So what do we do in this environment? This is a quote from the traffic engineer at Ann Arbor, Michigan. He said, it could turn out 100 different ways. We have to design and plan for flexibility. And to me, that's the main message that I would give to you, is that in everything that we think about for Annapolis, to think about varying scenarios from this to that, and how do we design things that have some flexibility in it. And I don't know the quote from that. They're the 80% fewer cars by when. I don't know, and neither do they, quite honestly. But that's the range of spread that you're seeing, dramatic reduction in the numbers of cars versus the dramatic increase in sprawl. And we just don't know where that's going to land. Here's what I think that is possible. I think you can think about flexibility, but in the same time, there are low risk investments even in this highly dynamic, uncertain environment. Here's what some of those look like. Maintenance and construction within existing right-of-way. That's a low risk investment. Traffic incident management, and I saw some of the questions that came in. To me, in our city here, traffic incident management and traffic signal system upgrades are the most sensible investment that we could make. And I don't know how familiar you are with traffic incident management. It's been around literally for decades, but it is where you have coordinated response plans, coordinated with city, county, fire, police, Naval Academy, so that when there is a crash out here on Forest Drive, we know how that works. There is a coordinated plan with signing, signal timing plans pre-worked out to help manage the traffic. Same thing, if there's a crash on Route 50 over the on the bridge, if there is a crash on the a Naval Academy bridge, we know what happens then. Creating traffic incident management plans that are coordinated with all the parties with the capability to adjust the signals. So that's the other thing. The county has installed new signal systems, not the city. It's as though you've got your high-end PC trying to communicate with a Commodore computer. And some of you might not even remember a Commodore computer. But that's not far off, actually, with the kind of situation that we have. There is no flexibility in that. There is no flexibility. We need the ability to be able to shift timing plans dynamically to manage the transportation network in the city, whether it's a peninsula, whether it's a grid, whatever it is, you need that flexibility. These are low risk improvements in today's environment. Data sharing, the stuff with NRICS and here and Waze, signs and lines. I was thrilled to see the county was out paving the other day, very little traffic volumes, a great time to strike. Basically anything with a short life cycle. That's a low risk investment right now. Here are the high risk investments. Anything with new right of way. Because it's not clear, you're going to need more lanes in all cases. It doesn't mean you don't do it, but it's just a higher risk. Big dollar investments. Parking garages are a high risk investment. Now, when I do work with the National Parking Association, I'm really impressed with their level of foresight. Those people are connecting the dots big time. They're looking at every trend that we've talked about today. And what they're doing is they're still building parking garages, but they're building them so they can be flex space. The floors are flat, they're high, so that when we don't have as many cars needing to park in the future, that space can be converted to mixed use. Now, the last I heard, I think that's actually what's being looked at for Hillman. And if it is, that's great. That's absolutely a great model for flexibility for something that we need now, which is a parking garage, but you have the flexibility for it to be used in a different way as things begin to evolve within the lifespan of a parking garage. Hillman's what, 50, 60 years old or something? You're absolutely going to have all this going on. Long-term agreements, let me jump to that one. A couple of years ago, I was doing a presentation in Florida, and they were so excited. They had just signed a 50-year agreement with a company to manage their parking garages. 50 years. We have no idea what the need for parking garages is going to be in 50. We're going to know it in 10 years. Long-term agreements like that are higher risk. Again, not necessarily don't do them, they're just higher risk. Anything that has a long project development cycle or a very long lifespan is high risk. Again, you still can choose to do them, just think about how you do them and can you design them for some flexibility to be able to adjust to what we see coming down the road. So when we look at designing for flexibility, I'm used to a state DOT kinds of project development process. There are ways to put in off-ramps in that project development process. So for example, we're going to create a comprehensive plan that spans decades, but at some point, individual projects come off of that planning document into a TIP, a transportation improvement program, where it's funded and scheduled. At that time, it's a really good moment to think about, well, what's changed? Has there been a new Uber that's popped up? What is the situation with technology now versus when we first put it on that comprehensive plan? For some projects, they have a lengthy environmental process. I worked on environmental impact statements that took 3 to 5 years. Within that time frame, you could have a whole Airbnb show up. So at the time it gets off of and finishes the environmental process, take another look. Does it still make sense? What do we know now that we didn't know then? Some projects have a long design phase. Again, some big interchanges can take 3 to 5 years to design them. You get ready to go to construction, really bad time to make changes, but better to assess changes then than to build it and find out that you have something that you can't use in the future that doesn't serve the needs of your citizens. The other part is to look at technology, to as much as possible be technology agnostic. You're going to have to support some technology. It's coming, it's inevitable, but support as many different types so that you have flexibility to go with whatever the technology and the wireless communication system is at the time. So it's all about technology flexibility. And so that's really my main message here today. Hopefully you've got some things to perhaps think about how these things are converging, but the name of the game is how do we be flexible and create an ability to move and adapt with our transportation system over the course of the span of time that we're looking at. And with that, I'm going to stop now. You all have been so patient and nice. Questions, comments, discussion, I'm available for whatever you would like to talk about.
Did you address all the comments that you had through your text messages?
So here's a question. With the future holding less cars parked outside of offices, how prudent is it to rebuild the parking garage today if it can be patched together for another 10 years and see what the future holds? So, so I don't know all the details around that. My high level answer to that would be, my understanding is that patching it together might not be the best choice. I think it might be past patching. If you can design it in a way that's flexible, then I think you actually get kind of the best of all worlds. You get support for parking that we can use today, particularly if we want to have an ability to redevelop some of the city dock area. And I was very fortunate to be on some of that plan with Alex on transportation. And it gives us some flexibility, again, to manage some of that construction when we have that parking, as long as it's designed where there is flexibility in the use of the garage for the future. To me, that's a wise choice for the city. That's my opinion. And I think so I am not clear on what the state of Maryland is doing in terms of automated vehicle research. You've got a lot of researchers. There's a big test bed in Virginia, by the way, that's done a lot of research. We worked with them a lot when I was at DOT. The question from Alex, does it matter what the reason for fewer or delayed driver's licenses is? I don't know that it matters why. I think it's just interesting that I think it's interesting that they're delaying, but I think the why matters because they're not as interested in driving. They're very happy to have other transportation solutions that give them transportation, but it doesn't have to be them behind the vehicle driving. And if that trend continues, then it implies some things about how we provide transportation service that isn't necessarily about my individual car. So I think that's why there's some relevance there. Okay, let's see, from Bob, what are projections on how to handle commuter traffic with multi-point origins and multi-point destinations? Limiting the amount of parking in new residential developments. Would you recommend limiting the amount of parking in new residential developments? So again, it depends on where you're going, but like I will use Uber to go from point A to point B, and then I use Uber to take me from point B to point C. And if I fast forward to the future, when I can get an automated vehicle that does the same thing, then I can just tell my app when to come pick me up where, and it can still do point to point. I just don't have to have my vehicle there. As for parking in residential developments, what do I think about that? I think of course, it always depends, right? It depends on the residential area and it depends on what you've got going on there. What we see happening and what I think I wouldn't do is to increase parking. What you see cities doing is capping the maximum amount of parking that's provided by a development. So saying we will allow this much parking, but we're not going to allow this much parking, because they're projecting that we're going to need fewer vehicles to make the same number of trips. And so you won't have the same demand for parking, but curb space becomes a much more interesting conversation about how do you manage curb space. So I don't know enough about it, Alex, to know if the 1.5 spaces per unit is too much. I wouldn't increase it. I certainly wouldn't go more and ask for more parking. That seems like the outside amount to me, just off the cuff. Because again, I think it's situational, but I certainly wouldn't require more than that. If we cap or decrease parking and don't increase curb space, don't we create chaos? Well, so the decrease in parking is with the assumption that the cars aren't parked, right? So if there's picking me up, it's dropping me off, and then it leaves to go get somebody else. So it does not need to park. So I don't know that. So it just needs a place to be able to pull up, drop me off, pick up somebody else, and then go again. So I might not be understanding correctly, Diane, though. And you're welcome to unmute too, if you'd like to, if I'm not quite getting what you want to talk about. But that's the premise behind capping the amount of parking, is that we can get the same amount of trip, but with fewer vehicles. Other comments, thoughts, questions, any reaction? I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I hope maybe it's helpful for you. Yeah, so I agree, Bob. The interval between now and when we have a fully autonomous future, and a fully autonomous future is quite a ways out. And this is the problem, is how to navigate the two. And this is one of the reasons it's so difficult to design a fully automated vehicle, because it has to account for so many different things. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. It's going to be interesting to see how it evolves. And part of it's going to have to do with the level of sophistication of the technology and the level of comfort that we can get with some of these more sophisticated technologies. Yeah, no easy answer on that one. Has this been helpful at all? Or are there at least some thoughts just to pique your interest a little bit? On autonomous, smaller buses vis-a-vis lower operating costs. Yeah. So again, this is not my area of deep expertise, but we do see smaller vehicles where they can be more nimble. Again, it's flexibility, right? It's all boils down to flexibility. So if you can have smaller vehicles that are able to be more on demand and use apps, right, for your paratransit service. We've seen some cities use Uber. It was cheaper for them to buy Uber service to provide their paratransit services than it was for them to operate buses. The other thing that I think would be interesting, this was a project that we worked on when I was running the program at DOT. If you look at transit services in small buses, you have communities for older people, you have medical communities, all of which are providing little buses to take people around on. We tried to pioneer some apps that would allow those to coordinate, because you got a bunch of empty buses running around, and you can use some of the technology to help sync some of that up.
And my thought on that was that there's you're essentially avoiding the personnel costs, so you can have much faster headways, even if, and especially if they're electric, the operating cost is going to be lower. So, if you do have much lower headways, but fewer riders per per hour, you're still going to have really good service, which in a way would incentivize use the service. Because
was
most
on
of the operating costs is in salaries and benefits
Yeah.
for the
The
drivers.
interesting thing, and Alex, you probably already know this, I was on listening to a panel discussion the other day, and it was several experts on electric vehicles. And they were saying the biggest hindrance in deployment of electric vehicles today is the dealership model. Dealerships get most of their income from maintenance, and electric vehicles have 4% of the maintenance cost of an internal combustion engine. So there's no real reason to sell them. You're just going to lose money on them in the long run. So that's a really good reason to have them be used in a city environment or for any kind of a fleet, because the maintenance costs just really plummet. And so that's where you can have a really good argument for using electric vehicles.
So the only other question I had about with respect to cost is certainly once autonomous vehicles are more prevalent, the cost will go down. But the cost of technology, especially if you're LiDAR based, is prohibitively expensive. So I mean, I don't think even in the next 20 years you're going to see that be at a scale where you know, a regular person who might buy now a $30,000 car is going to be able to afford something like that. But in a shared model, different story. But for privately owned vehicles, I think the cost is going to be prohibitively expensive even 20 years from now. That's my personal opinion. But
Most of us, I think, would believe that it's not an individual ownership model. That it's unlikely to be that I'm going to go out and buy my own AV. But that the AVs would be used by transportation companies who are providing that service. That's why Ford and General Motors would like to build them, right? They can build them and then they operate the service. And now they're making money on the service model and can amortize the cost a little bit differently. It's still super expensive today, but you know, they'll figure some of it out too.
So I'm sorry, I want to follow up on one of my initial comments about Uber not being profitable.
Yes.
I'm still having a hard time seeing how they get to profitability. I mean, they have a lot of revenue, certainly, but they're still not really a profitable company. So I'm still having trouble seeing how they get there.
Take out the driver.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so they're looking at, and so that's why Google spent so much money on them, right? Google sees Google has a ton of money in Waymo, which is their self-driving vehicle arm, and then now they've got a lot of money in Uber. So you just pull the two things together, and that's kind of a future that I think they're betting on, and it changes the economics. It changes the economics dramatically. Whether it fixes the problem, I don't know, but it's just a whole different model. And so there was a question. So someone said there was a question earlier about funding. I'm not sure I saw that. I'm looking.
I had one about the funding. You mentioned the parking garages and parking spaces going away. That was a large proportion of funding for transportation. Can you elaborate upon that? Exactly what percentage is that roughly and how that's going to affect us?
Well, again, we don't know, right? You're talking about that slide.
No, what's the existing proportion that most transportation departments deal with that being funding?
For what part of, you mean coming from parking or coming from gas tax or?
Parking.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers on that, Ben. You know, because I spent most of my career on the federal level and we didn't get parking revenue. We got gas tax money. So I don't know. Perhaps Sally might have a better idea than I do on what that looks like for the city of Annapolis. I don't remember. I think this graphic that you see on the screen, this is from the National League of Cities study, and I think this is the aggregate of what they got in their study. And so in this case, you can see a fair amount is coming from parking, traffic citations. Everything on here, though, is predicated on me driving a car.
I don't really know. I know we get a lot of our revenue from parking, especially the parking garages, but I don't know the details beyond that.
Fair
Yeah,
enough. We
and
do have the data. I remember it being over 2 million for the parking garage, but we'll go from there.
I have a question. I love the message about flexibility and how important it is to be flexible. If we want to build in some of that into our plan and be able to check back every couple of years or so and see what path we're on, what are some good milestones to look for in the future?
Good question. Good question. And so let me make sure that I understand. So you're thinking about what kinds of indicators would you watch for that would make you
Right.
go, wait, we need to take another look at that.
Right.
That's a good question.
Exactly.
Off the top of my head, I would absolutely watch AV penetration rates and business models. And as you begin to see those coming up and you get into level 3 and 4 actually going on the market, I would be watching that. I would watch the mobility as a service model and see how that is evolving and just see how that takes off. It's gonna take a little bit of critical mass before it can actually go. And then curb space. I would watch your demand for curb space. Because you're going to see that right now with Uber, Lyft, pickup and drop offs for packages. You might be in a situation where you got to trade off some parking, even in the near term, for curb access. Because you can't, you're faced with then in downtown having all these vehicles stopped, double parked in the middle of the road.
Yes, that's very annoying when that happens. Thank you. Yep.
Frida had an email earlier about, the buses. And again, where's the appropriate place for them to go sit? Probably not in the middle of the residential community. Can you connect federal funding requirement to purchase full-size bus? No, actually I can't, Bob. So I did not ever work with Federal Transit Administration. I am aware that they have a requirement to purchase full-size buses. I don't know the history behind it. I don't know the background. It doesn't seem smart to me, but usually those things have some basis in reasonableness, but I just don't know what it is in that case. I question it myself more and more as the technology changes and the way that we travel changes. But I'm afraid I don't know anything about that. I would rather see you be able to purchase smaller ones too. I think that makes a lot more sense in terms of flexibility for ridership and routes and all of that. Yeah, I don't get it either. I don't get it. And unfortunately, I spent most of my career at the federal government with the Federal Highway Administration or at USDOT in the Secretary's office. And sometimes it's really hard to change those things that have been there a long time, even though it just doesn't make sense anymore. Yeah, and that doesn't help, I know, but it's hard. Anything else from me? I think you all know how to reach me. I'm at, actually, let me see, I think it's on here. Here I am. So my normal business, I started the Insightful Leadership Institute, and most of my work is around doing leadership development, particularly for technical people, engineers, and folks like me. Because I feel like that we have a lot of good problem-solving, fact-based skill sets that would be great in leadership these days, but only if we can create and understand the relationship skills and how to see beyond the data. So that's what I do primarily. I have a newsletter where I write about those kinds of issues. If you're interested in being on that, I'd be happy to add you to it. But otherwise, it's just been a pleasure to be here, and I hope there's been something useful for you today, because I love Annapolis and would love to do what I can to help us be successful in the future. So thank you, Bob, for helping me letting me be on here.
Yes, thank you, Bob, for pestering Shelley to join us today. And Shelley, I can't thank you enough for coming out to, or staying in tonight and talking to us all. I know we really appreciate being able to understand better what the future of transportation holds for us.
So
Well,
finally being a nag has its benefits, huh? Finally, my being a nag. Kelly, it was wonderful. You know, this is what 2 drinks got us at a Christmas party.
That's right. That's right. And I'm about to go have 2 more, Bob.
You're wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And Julian, thanks so much for hosting. And I think I can post this presentation online if you want to send it to your friends who missed out.
Great. Thank you,
Great.
Sally.
Great.
Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you, Shelley.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Shelley.